And I want to kind of show you how to use this, because if you only ever have waxed chalk paint or milk paint or something that's porous, a surface that's porous, then wax is gonna react very differently if you're waxing something that has a finish on it. And so these chairs, they do have a little bit of a finish on it. It's sometime somebody put a poly or a varnish or something on them. Now in certain places, it's worn off, like here on the backs, it's really worn off. You can feel, but down here on the legs, it's still pretty slick. And so when we put the wax on places where there is a finish already, it doesn't react the same as it does when you're putting it over in something that's porous. It'll just, over chalk paint or milk paint or like raw wood or even wood that's been stained but you haven't top coated yet, it's just gonna soak up the wax. When you put it over something that's a sealed finish, like if you put wax on top of fusion mineral paint, or if you put wax on top of something that's got a poly or a varnish, it just works differently. And you gotta be a little bit careful with it, because you may go back and wind up wiping it all back off. And so that's why I kind of wanted to demonstrate this process. So I like to wax with a brush, a good round natural bristle brush. This is an old brush that I have that I painted with for a while, and now it's just kind of turned into a wax brush. If you use a brush to wax with, be sure to clean the wax out of it when you're done. The best way to do that is to swirl it in some odorless mineral spirits. That's gonna get the wax out, and then you wash the mineral spirits out with some warm water and dish soap. And so that's how you take care of your wax brushes. And then I have the Fusion Mineral Paint Liming Wax. And I'm gonna show you guys, this is, it's white with just a little, that looks really white in the light. It's white with a tiny hint of cream to it. So it's not a bright white. It has just a little bit of kind of a yellowish tint to it. And then I've got an old t-shirt, and those are my supplies. And this wax doesn't have any odor, so I can wax inside. And in fact, when it gets warm like this, I recommend waxing inside. If you're working with a wax that doesn't have that odor, some of them, especially some that I've worked with that are kind of like some hardware store waxes, can have a really strong odor. And those I tend to work with outside. But when it's hot, and it's getting to be hot, at least here in Texas it is, I bring my wax and my paint inside, which is just because it dries better and I don't have to worry about the humidity. And that's one of the things I love about the whole Fusion Mineral Paint line of products, is that I can use it all inside because there's nothing, no odors, and there's nothing toxic coming from it. So I'm gonna just start working on this chair. I'm gonna dab a little bit just on my brush, and you don't want to get a ton, but just a little bit. And then I'm just going to start working it in. And the places where I really want it to settle, let's see, let's raise this up just a hair. Hi, Tina. Glad you're here today. The places where I really want it to settle are down in these recesses. Rub a little bit more in. And that's also kind of why I like using a brush, because it pushes the wax down into, really kind of down into the creases of the wood and those detail spots. You can see it starting to show up here in the little flower. Just really pushing it in there. Now I want to show you, this is what happens if I come back too quickly. Again, this has a little bit of a finish on it, so it's not just soaking this wax immediately up. So if you're used to waxing and then coming right back and wiping it off, let me show you what happens. I'm going to wipe pretty much all of it off. So now it is going to kind of stay down there in those details. You can still see it. Let's move this up. Can you still see it kind of there in those details? But I want there to be a little bit more wax left than that. So I'm going to put some back on here, and then I'm going to leave it for a little bit and let it dry out before I go back and start wiping it off. That's what you have to do when you're waxing a surface that has a finish on it is let it sit and dry out for just a little bit. Sometimes I even leave my wax jar open and let the wax itself start drying out a little bit, or I dab just a little bit on my brush and let it start drying out a bit on my brush. Because you kind of have to, it's not just soaking into the wood, and so you have to let it sit and dry for probably 15, 20 minutes, maybe even 30 minutes, and then go back and you can lightly buff it. But I'm just really lightly kind of brushing it on here. I'm not putting a ton on my brush. Very little, you can see. I'm brushing it on and kind of stippling it on. And be sure to kind of work in sections. Do the inside here. But I hope you can see even it's starting to change this side of the chair and down. See a little difference than in the color than in this side right here. It's taking away a little bit of that orange and giving it a little bit of a hazy finish. Now the back pieces right here, almost all the finish is off because years of people's backs rubbing up against them. So these pieces here are soaking up the wax a little bit more. So I don't have to be quite as careful. If I go white here, it's not going to wipe back quite as much. I've already done one chair. I've barely used any of this. So sometimes when people get these little tiny jars, they think, wow, that's not going to go very far. But you use so little of the product that it really does. One of these little tiny jars goes a long way. I will definitely be able to get all 3 of my chairs done and probably won't even look like I hardly used any of my product. So adding something like this is just a good way to, if you find some pieces at the flea market or at your local thrift store, and you just want to do a little bit of something to them. Maybe you don't want to paint them, but you want to do a little bit of something. Adding a little bit of some sort of wax to it can be a great way to just customize what you're finding. And I really like pairing the liming wax with pine. It also works really well with oak. Oak has that deep grain to it, and so the liming wax will really soak down into the grain of the oak, and it works really well with that too. So these places here are still pretty slick. They have a good bit of finish left on them, so I'm really just kind of dabbing this wax in these spots. Here we go. And again, I'm going to let it sit for a little bit. Just going to keep dabbing onto my brush. Keep working it in. Just going to kind of tap a little bit of that extra off. It's hard to see. See, that's the look that we're getting. Just a little bit of a haze. And down here, the bottom of the legs, see, this part has not been done. See that that's a good bit more orangey. And then you put a little bit of this liming wax on and see it takes off some of that orange and you get that pickled white haze.